In season 2 of the Best of Health podcast, I am shining a spotlight on all of the life stages of women's health, from menarche to post-menopause. Topics covered will range literally from head to toe, addressing migraines to vaginal health and everything in between. My conversations are going to be with leading experts in their field, and we will tap into a deep well of knowledge and uncover an array of clinical pearls which promise to be an illuminating and helpful support to your personal health journey. So grab a cuppa and join me this autumn for the Best of Health Season 2, Women's Health Uncovered. So welcome back, everybody, to the Best of Health podcast Season 2, where we are shining the spotlight on all things women's health. And today I am thrilled to have with me the wonderful Debbie Cotton. Debbie is, I've known for many years. In fact, Debbie was one of my lecturers in my final year at the College of Naturopathic Medicine. She has many strings to her bow, a few of which I am going to just talk about now so that you have a great understanding of what the focus that we're going to be talking about today. So Debbie is an Australian and she trained as a naturopath, was the first string to her bow at the Australian College of Natural Medicine. Which, interestingly enough, is where I started myself as well, many years ago before I came back to the UK. But that was just the beginning of the journey for Debbie. And she then went on to complete a Bachelor of Health Science at Charles Sturt University, obviously still in Australia. And she is also a psychotherapist. She's a naturopath. She is a herbalist. She's a body worker. And if you look at her website, which we will refer to in the show notes, she has many other strings to her bow. And within the UK here, she used to lecture for CNM, and I think she still does some particular education, but she is head of clinical education for the human microbiome company that many of the practitioners that are listening may be familiar with, called In Vivo Health. And she is responsible for helping educate and train clinicians all around the different amazing microbiome assessment testing that they offer. So Debbie, welcome so much to the podcast. I'm so thrilled to have you here and delve into your amazing brain about all things microbiome. Welcome.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm excited to be chatting to you today about one of my favorite microbiomes.
Yeah. So with that in mind, so we are framing today, we are going to be talking about the vaginal microbiome, because when we think about the term microbiome, which maybe it would be good even with that terminology, just to get your explanation on that, on what that is. We really think of the gut. So, but today we're going to be focusing on another very important cavity where there is an important microbiome, which is sort of the vaginal microbiome. So, Debbie, could you, in your words, describe what the microbiome is, and the microbiota?
Sure. So they're kind of complex words that get thrown around a lot, but basically the term microbiota refers to a group of microbes, and in those microbes it could be bacteria, fungus, protozoa, like lots of different microbes together. But when we talk about a microbiome, what we're talking about is a group of microbes, so a microbiota, in a host or in a certain environment. So we're looking at the environment and the community of microbes that lives in it together. So when we talk about microbiomes, we normally talk about them in specific niches in the body, because every different environment will have a different community. So we've got oral microbiomes, your nasal microbiome, skin microbiome, and of course today we're going to be talking about the vaginal microbiome.
And so with that in mind, what would you, as both a clinician and as a educator, what would you define as a healthy vaginal microbiota?
That's a really good question. So researchers have been working on this over the last 10 years or so, because what changed for us with the microbiome was basically we were able to start to do new types of testing techniques, which would show us the different types of bacteria that live in a microbiome that didn't normally come out when you tried to culture with a kind of a petri dish. And so because of that, we're now able to kind of catalog really different vaginal microbiomes and start to then correlate that obviously with symptoms and start to kind of talk about what's a healthy and an unhealthy microbiome. Now, the first kind of group to do this was Ravel, and they kind of came up with, they noticed that kind of women with healthy microbiomes, and when they say healthy, they mean no symptoms, basically fall into different categories. So not everyone's going to have one certain microbiome that's healthy. There's about 4 or 5 different categories, and actually researchers now have added to that, so it's going up to 6 or 7 different categories of, and what they're basically doing is classifying the microbiome in the vagina about who is the most dominant microbe that lives there. So who's got dominance, and then they name the community after that. So, for example, so we've got
what's referred to as a community. We've heard this term of community states. Is that?
That's right. They call them community. Ravel, that those researchers came up with the name community state type, and they're kind of saying, okay, if we've got 500 women, 100, and say all of these ones are healthy, women with healthy vaginas. So we've got 100 that were dominant in Lactobacillus crispatus, for example. We're going to call them group 1, and we've got 100 that are dominant in Lactobacillus ginsengii, and we call them group 2, and so on and so forth. So that's how they've kind of tried to classify it, because they've noticed that bacteria grow in certain communities, basically. So
how fascinating. And I would imagine, or is this not the case, are there within these different community states, is there a correlation around their environment, so their ethnic backgrounds?
Absolutely.
Does that correlate?
Absolutely. So, so kind of the original research was they first found the community state types, and then the next bit of research was kind of saying, well, who has what, basically. And they do find that different ethnic groups will have different affinities to different types of microbes, and that's obviously because of genetics. There will be some genetics involved there, and just what your body kind of prefers to have a relationship with. But equally, there's going to be some environmental input. So where you live in the world is going to have, your dietary input, your environmental input will have different microbes that, will be more likely be healthy in that particular cohort.
Amazing. So. Okay, fascinating. And then just to be clear, there seems to be, I think, this tendency about good and bad, demonizing, whether that's food, whether it's nutrients, and I think the same is true within sort of the microbiome. So that when we talk about these community states, which you've just alluded to, are ever evolving, they're coming up with another. It's not about good and bad. If you're community type 1 versus 3, it's about what is within that, what is the population that is documented within each type. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think what you've pointed out really clearly there is, even in the gut, anywhere else, there is no such thing as a normal microbiota. Because basically we always have to look at the microbiome, which is the host and who is the environment, and the microbes together. And actually that's going to be very, very different. Say if I was in rural Thailand to here, what would be normal, what would be okay, because we've got different diets, different environmental inputs. So it's, there are some clear microbes that we know are pathogens, but that's only a really, really small few. In most of the time, we just, we're going to sit in kind of healthy community groups, and it's just interesting to know what they might be and when they then shift away from healthy.
Perfect. Great. And so if we use that sort of terminology, healthy, in terms of the population within each group, we hear a lot, because the focus has been on the gut, around diversity and sort of ecosystems. And does the same run true within the vaginal microbiome, or it's diversity is not necessarily king within the vaginal microbiome?
Yeah, so yes and no, basically. So the vagina will not be as diverse naturally as the gut, and the reason for this is because in the gut there is so much food going in and so many microbes that we're coming into contact with, whereas the vagina is a bit more of a closed community, and the food for the microbes generally comes from us, from our own cervical mucus. So we tend to feed sort of quite specific bacteria that are healthy for us, and that's generally not in all kind of community state types, but that's generally lactobacilli. So we normally tend in the vagina not to be as diverse. There will be still a little bit of diversity, but not as diverse, and there will be a dominance in a group, and that dominance is generally what tells us if it's healthy or associated with symptoms.
Okay. So it's generally the diversity of the phyla, for example, so
Yes.
the larger family group is less, but we know that there are specific species within each community type. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Great. Okay. And what would you say is, if we think about different types of health conditions for women, so fertility obviously is a big one, and I'm so interested in the work that you've been doing with In Vivo and within the greater community around this, and sort of understanding and uncovering different microbes or sort of the healthy communities within each state type, and as it relates to fertility. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the things with, I guess, we've started talking about a healthy vaginal community, but obviously any community of microbes can shift into what we call dysbiosis, which means an imbalance in the microbes. And they could be microbes that normally do live there, but it's just the percentage of them has changed around a little bit, and some of them have become more dominant than they should. And that can be linked with local symptoms. So sometimes the first alert that you might have a bit of an issue going on here might be the presence of thrush, or the presence of something known as bacterial vaginosis, which is a change in your secretions might be going on. Or in some cases it might be you're getting some itching, some pain, some redness, and this might be another change in kind of the bacterial population. So for some people they get symptoms basically, and we know that there's a problem there. But equally, one of the things about the vaginal microbiome is it can also play a role in other sort of reproductive microbiomes, such as the uterus microbiome, the ovarian microbiome, because it kind of communicates with them so much. And it can be linked in a dysbiosis state. And there are some certain bacteria that can be linked with infertility in some cases, but also a higher risk of miscarriage or preterm births. And some of these are clear pathogens. Some of these are ones, they can be sexually transmitted diseases. But sometimes there are our own microbes that have gone out of balance basically as well. So it's not necessarily a bad guy. It's more that things have kind of shifted in the wrong way. And so a lot of people that are undergoing sort of IVF or other sort of assisted reproductive techniques might actually want to be looking into their vaginal microbiome, looking at how they can support themselves to have a healthy microbiome to kind of reduce these risk factors basically.
Yes, of course. That's just so illuminating, isn't it? Because that and the intricacy of that communication from different locations, and that communication within the female reproductive system is it never fails to fascinate me and reignite my passion for why we work in this area, because we know more than we did 5-10 years ago, but there's still it's so intricate, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
so then even the intervention which is done for the benefit of someone going through IVF, I would imagine that is the amount of interventions that a woman would go through is going to be changing the environment of all of the microbiomes. So that communication, it's not a finite process, is it? It depends on what has gone before with that woman as to sort of what this new intervention is making and how that's going to be shifting their own individual community state. Does that?
Absolutely. So, in reproductive years, theoretically, our community state should be nice and balanced. It will fluctuate a little bit during the month, but it should be the same species that just fluctuate a little bit in their amounts. But, the trouble is if you stress a microbiome, then you can do that by stressing the environment. And if the environment is us, so that can be hormonal stress, it can by taking medications, it can be antibiotics, which can really upset the vaginal microbiome and allow different communities to flourish.
Mm-hmm.
It can be lots of internal examinations, obviously fingers, penises, sex toys, all of these things may or may not have microbes on them that can upset the vaginal microbiota, and especially if your immune's a bit low anyway. If you have poor sugar regulation, so diabetes or insulin resistance, these sort of things can also change the environmental input, and lack of estrogen actually can change your secretions, and therefore you don't feed your lactobacilli very well. So there's lots of things that can actually, from a host perspective, so looking at our own health before we look at the vagina, it can actually alter the vaginal microbiome.
Brilliant. Amazing. Fantastic. And what diagnostic sort of techniques are available then to help us define the health of this amazing ecosystem? I mean, again, and I would just caveat that in terms of we have the best available, but everything it's through the lens of everything that has just gone before from what you've said about the environmental input that changes this day to day.
Yeah. So basically with the vaginal microbiota, you can obviously pop in and see your GP and you can get what's known as a swab and culture. Now, a swab and culture is a slightly older microbiology technique, methodology. It can be handy for some things, so it will grow a pathogen often quite nicely, but it often won't show you what your healthy community is. So if you're going to look for pathogens, a swab and culture at the GP is a really good way of doing so, starting out sometimes, but it's not going to give you the whole story. It's not going to give you sort of what kind of the rest of the healthy community you're doing, and if you could improve on that healthy community, because actually that's when it comes to fertility, some of the outcomes have been linked to not necessarily what's there, but what's not there, the lack of lactobacilli, for example. So the newer techniques then come to what we call different DNA technologies. So what DNA technologies do is they don't have to culture a sample. So that is, they don't have to grow the bacteria on a dish. You get a swab and basically, the technique, there's a few different techniques in here, but the one we particularly use at NVivo is PCR, which you would have heard of with coronavirus.
Yeah. That's the word that everybody
knows that they didn't before. But there are different DNA techniques, basically. And what these DNA techniques do is they actually can look for specific microbes and pick them out of a sample without them having to grow. So we can actually see quite clearly how much of something is in a sample and quite specifically what specific species are there. So it means that what used to be unculturable, we can now see. So we can also see all of the healthy bacteria, and this is where all the community state type information comes from. They use DNA technologies, basically. And so if you are testing more for a fertility point of view or a health optimization, if you can kind of go privately and get sort of these more expanded DNA tests, it's a really good way of working towards health. But like I said, your swab and culture is still good for kind of your baseline intervention when looking for kind of the thrush or BV or something along those lines at the kind of the beginning.
Okay, I was just going to circle back round to that, and you've answered that. So yeah, a swab and culture is a great first tick off for bacterial vaginosis or any sort of that type of that type of dysbiotic infection.
Yeah. Or, testing for STDs.
Yeah.
Well, actually, to be fair, they don't use swab and culture anymore for STDs. They use PCR. They've changed. So, yeah.
Okay.
So, because it's just much more accurate and you can get, much more information out of a sample. You don't need the bacteria to survive on the swab to the lab to be able to culture it and then hope like hell it does culture on the dish. So, this is the cool thing about DNA technologies. They're much, much more accurate.
But the approach is still very much acute care, isn't it, really?
Yes.
Whereas everything that you've just described about, I mean, I always have this picture of a library of, I look behind me, look at my sort of shelves of books and thinking about what we can see from this panel when we're looking at PCR is sort of missing microbes. We're looking at gaps on the shelves, and we're looking at preventative healthcare, and we're looking at state community types as well.
Absolutely. And that's the major difference between acute care, which is just dropping into your GP and getting a culture, or going privately and looking at these kind of more DNA technologies like PCR, looking for kind of further information to make kind of healthier lifestyle choices or environmental, making your vagina an optimum environment for the microbes.
Okay, brilliant. Which actually segues into another question around, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation around the food, the fodder, if you like, to help this growth. And within this lovely commune, we're talking about mucus, and we're talking about, sort of the mucus environment and the right pH. Would that be right?
That's correct. So basically, a healthy vagina, one thing I should have mentioned earlier, should all in the reproductive years. So it's really important we're talking reproductive years right now, because it's different for children and different for menopause. But a vagina in reproductive years is generally quite acidic in nature. This acidity comes from normally a dominant group of lactobacilli. And what these lactobacilli do is they eat glycogen, which comes from a kind of cervical secretions. It's quite rich in it, and it's the estrogen that helps to make these secretions. And when it eats these kind of its substrates, what it then makes is metabolites, and these metabolites can be specific antimicrobial peptides, which are special little proteins that stop other bacteria from overgrowing, but they also make lactic acid and hydrogen peroxide. So, it's probably not talked about enough, but sometimes women might notice that they bleach their underwear a little bit, and you can blame the lactobacilli from that, and that's quite incredible. That's quite normal. Like, that's because of a level of hydrogen peroxide basically in your vaginal microbiome, and that makes it healthy. That stops other bacteria from overgrowing. It's kind of making the lactobacilli makes an environment that stops other bacteria from overgrowing.
Yep. So that hydrogen peroxide, for those of you listening that aren't practitioners, is sort of like a, you may have heard of it, to use to dye your hair.
Dye your hair blonde, yeah.
But it's our natural production of it's like a little antimicrobial gun or bit of arsenal that we have up our sleeve to kind of help to keep that environment nice and,
well, in this case, up our vagina, but yes.
Our vagina. Yeah, exactly. And then you mentioned that actually estrogen plays a big part in that. So this is why, to connect some dots for people, would this be why at certain points in a woman's menstrual cycle, they would notice more mucus production? So when that estrogen is peaking, so as it builds up, and then as it drops off. Is that how that works?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in our normal menstrual cycle, when our estradiol peaks, so does you get that lovely ovulation mucus, which is generally really handy for sperm to be able to swim through, but also is really rich in food for the vaginal microbiota as well.
Lovely. Brilliant. So when you are looking at this type of picture, obviously, as with all of the tools that you have in your kit bag, from being a naturopath, a herbalist, a forager, and also a psychotherapist, because the mind-body connection. When you start to think about more natural sort of therapeutics to nurture, let's maybe split this into two. So what do you think about in terms of mucus and sort of and barrier health, first of all?
Sure. So if we first look to the environment, like the mucus and the barrier, what I'm thinking about is how is this person, how is their kind of their skin barrier in general, or what we call the epithelial barrier? And is it nice and subtle? And if not, if it's breaking a lot, it's going to let more microbes deeper in and might set up inflammation. So what can help there is some more looking at kind of nutritionally at things like omega-7 oil or sea buckthorn, which is quite good for mucosal membranes. But it's also all of your nutrients such as zinc or vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin E, all of these really important nutrients for the health of our sort of thin mucosal linings, and they can play an important role too.
And can I ask, Debbie, are any of these, sorry,
you go for it.
Can any of these be applied topically, like vitamin E, for example?
Absolutely. So if you're prone to tearing of your vaginal epithelia, you can use pure vitamin E oil. Be careful about creams and stuff because they might have extra additives and stuff in them. You want to keep it as kind of as simple as possible, basically, when it comes to the vagina. But yes, absolutely, you can use them topically and internally, so you can kind of put them in the area. Sea buckthorn, I would normally take orally. I take by mouth and not necessarily topically. And also things like, you can support yourself with vitamin C and collagen supplements, but that would be orally as well, not topically.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant. And then if we think about probiotics, so maybe let's just explain what a probiotic is for people that are not practitioners. Would you do the honor?
Sure. So when we talk about a probiotic, we're talking about a bacteria that we know lives with humans and confers us a benefit. So, and then we normally can isolate them and take them, orally. So to add to our own sort of community. The thing with probiotics is they normally work as you're taking them. So they get you buy them and they're often freeze dried. And as they hit the stomach and all the water in the stomach, they get activated, they start working and metabolizing. And sometimes it's not even the probiotic itself that's super important. It's what the probiotic makes as it's going through your gut can have a really big impact on both your immune system, your microbial composition, and kind of lots of different functions. And normally when we talk about probiotics, people think about them for gut health. They think about, it might reduce my bloating, or it might, help with my diarrhea or IBS, all those sort of things. But actually, because they make all these kind of spiffy metabolites that talk a lot to our immune system, they can often play very big, larger roles. Like really, they can do a lot in kind of calming our immune system down. Some of the metabolites can be important in things like mental health, like, the kind of the list of probiotics goes on and on. And when we come to the vaginal probiotics, what's really cool is actually, even if you take some of these probiotics orally, they do still get to the vagina. So whether it's they crawl or whether it's just, there's some sort of quorum sensing, which is some sort of communication that's going on. But we do find those particular species in the vagina after taking them orally. And there they have, again, that same sort of impact. They make the lovely hydrogen peroxide. They make the lactic acid. They stop the overgrowth of the other bacteria. They communicate to the immune system in our vagina. So all of those things help to kind of rebalance the community, as well as hopefully you're changing your own environment and lifestyle alongside as well.
Brilliant. Oh my goodness. You just answered every question that I had to put to you so beautifully. So we don't know. We know that they do make that perilous journey from the gut to and we know that they confer health benefits, and we know that, and there are specific strains and species that we would choose within a probiotic formula for those specific for those benefits, aren't there?
Absolutely. So if you're looking for vaginal health, you really want to look at specific strains that have been researched that A, they reach the vagina, and B, that they exert an impact. So I've obviously got a bias here, so I'm going to talk about like some of the probiotics we have, but one of them would be we're looking at kind of specific species that we've found on research trials reach the vagina. So we know that they get there. We've done, there's been PCR probes to see that specific species that's been taken reaches the vagina. But equally, there's been human clinical trials showing that if you take them when you've got bacterial vaginosis, it reduces the reoccurrence and reduces the bacterial vaginosis. So that's the sort of stuff you want to do with any probiotic, I'd have to say, is try and pick one, not just because probiotics are kind of a blanket, but try and pick them really specific for the function that they do.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, absolutely, I wholeheartedly agree. And I can talk, I said there's one of the products that you have is called Fem UT. And yeah, absolutely, for me, knocked a UTI on the head sort of within 24 hours. So
amazing.
Yeah, they really truly are incredible. So the knowledge and the research behind, as you say, sort of conferring their health benefits. It's not just about, gone are the days of taking a multi-strain, as many numbers as you can, throwing it at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
It's long gone.
And that was great when we had no information, but now we can really drill down into specific strains and how they behave and what they do and the metabolites they make and how they impact our different microbiotas. So it's always good to kind of go, if I've got eczema, I'm going to choose X. If I've got a vaginal problem, I'm going to choose Y. So yeah.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. So probably one sort of final question that I would have for you with this particular area. I could talk to you all day and would love to get you back on. But you just alluded to the fact that there is a sort of a mental health component. We know about the sort of the gut brain axis. But I suppose I can't quite let you go without sort of just delving into that a little bit in terms of that communication between sort of our microbes as a whole and our mood.
Sure. So one of the, again, there's been a lot of research and a lot of talk of the gut-brain axis. And there is a lot of nerves that run from our brain to our gut. And, so there's kind of a direct stimulus effect that can go back and forth. But equally, there's a lot of communication in a roundabout way between the microbes in our gut and also our immune system and our nervous system. And they do this they can make actually neurotransmitters, which is what the same metabolites that our brain uses and our nervous system uses to communicate to each other. So some microbes actually do that. For example, bifidobacterium does that. But equally, a lot of microbes play a massive role in regulating our immune system and keeping it nice and calm. And these days, the newer paradigm about thinking about mental health is thinking about a nervous system or a brain that's slightly inflamed, like it's a slight immune response that's going on as well. And so, microbes can play a really important role in kind of dampening this immune response to make it kind of easier to heal. Now, don't get me wrong, that's one way that things happen. We've still got trauma and other things as well. But what the interesting thing is it's a kind of a two-way process, because trauma has also been shown to impact our microbes, like down the other way. So it's remembering that actually our microbiomes are actually an organ unto themselves, and without them you would die. So we want that kind of two-way communication to be working well. So.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And I said that was the last question, but actually one more, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So with what is your view on women's health products such as FemFresh and sprays and around the impact of that on both the delicate tissue and the community?
So Our vagina is self-cleaning. It doesn't need kind of any products to clean it, especially internally. So it's best just to use water. If you are going to be using any soaps externally, make sure they're kind of at a pH that is going to fit with the vagina. But it's really, we don't need, if you have noticed there's an abnormal smell, that's normally a really good sign that your bacterial community is shifted in such a way that you need bigger support. So it might be going to get tested to see if you have got bacterial vaginosis, or maybe your lactobacilli have dropped off slightly. It might not even be your imbalanced. It might just, it might not be an infection, but it might just be your lactobacilli have dropped off and you're noticing a change in smell. And a lot of that can then be shifted via, probiotics and diet and lifestyle and sleeping more, stress reduction, those sort of things. So, if you're kind of feeling that you're reaching for anything along those lines, it's a really good sign of going, actually, maybe I need to investigate a bit further, or speak to other women, because actually, some smell of the vagina is normal. There is a normal smell of the vagina, and actually it should be something that we should celebrate, not necessarily try and spray over.
And presumably that changes again through both a menstrual cycle and also life stages. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So often in life stage, like both children and menopausal women there'll be quite a big change there as well in the kind of the communities that grow. So that will definitely, the smell will change slightly as well there too.
Okay. Thank you, Debbie. You've been amazing. So if listeners wanted to investigate their vaginal microbiome more, where can they find, where can they get this testing done?
Basically, so our particular tests that we run at In Vivo are all through practitioners. So you can either reach out to us at In Vivo and we can put you in contact with someone. But obviously, you've got the amazing Tanya in front of you who can do it, and she's really good at vaginas. So
that was not a plug for me at all.
I'm plugging you because you're brilliant. So it's just reaching. We kind of ask that you have a practitioner on board for doing these tests, because we think it's really important to have that sort of stewardship and that support when reading the tests, and to not get panicked and think, oh, I need to, eradicate things, or actually think, there is something I can do, and feel really empowered. So that's the reason that we kind of really ask that you go through a practitioner to kind of access these tests.
That's great. I mean, I would herald that, and we will put in the show notes the testing, and then we can direct you to working with me, but a whole array of other really qualified practitioners. And to finish up on that, Debbie's the synergy between In Vivo and the way that they present their testing is so much around I will pick out on a word there that Debbie used, stewardship, in terms of this is a journey. It is not about a one bug, one pathogen, one supplement approach. It is about understanding your environment, the impact that your life has had on all of your microbiomes and your communities, and then understanding sort of what the presentation is now. So, and this knowledge with people like that Debbie can give and we can pass on to you is just so helpful for preventative healthcare, which has never, ever been more needed and more part of our growing connecting of the dots community approach to healthcare.
Absolutely.
I thank you so much, Debbie. You're just such a wealth of information, and please do come back and join us again.
Oh, my pleasure. I'd love to.
Great. Thank you so much, and we will see you on another episode soon.